So good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us on an unusual Tuesday morning. And it's a great pleasure to have Amy Janzwood today with us, presenting her research. And as we'll tell you in a second, research that comes very, hot off the PhD print. We're not quite printed yet, but, the defense is scheduled for later in November. But before I introduce Amy, let me just walk you through a couple of points before we start off the presentation. First of all, I would like to acknowledge with respect to the Kwang peoples on whose territory, traditional territory, the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and the Samish peoples, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. And I suppose that we will hear a little bit from Amy as well, how the traditional territory of indigenous communities is affected by the pipelines and how the whole fight about unceded territory plays into the politics of oil and resource extraction and pipelines. So here again, it's barely an issue that we take on that doesn't speak to the contested governance of land and the legacy of indigenous rule over this land. Also, you all are pros by now. The housekeeping rules. Please keep your mics muted, your cameras turned off while Amy's presenting, and then as we move into the Q&A session, it would be wonderful if you could switch your camera on and ask your question directly. If not, you can also leave your question in the chat box. And I think you're also aware that this presentation will be recorded and made available. And here you see the opportunity to raise your hand or leave your comment or question in the chat box. I think we have all become pros in Zoom. And here you see where in the end you will see our global talks being archived and made available to other people as well later on. I understand we are working now on, I think Shepa's talk is coming up soon, if I'm not mistaken. So we're almost up to date and gradually update our archive with respect to the recording global talks. All right, that I think does bring us to Amy Janzwood, who is a PhD candidate in social political science and environmental studies at the University of Toronto, and also a CFGS Visiting Graduate Student. And as I told you, Amy will defend her PhD at the end of the month. So what she's presenting now is really, the quintessence of her findings of her doctoral research. Amy also has a Master's of Arts in Global Governance from the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And as we will see in a second, her research interest includes issues of energy politics, how it's being challenged, social movements involved, the politics of pipelines and oil, if you want. So from a mostly comparative politics perspective, but clearly also interested in political economy and environmental politics. And she has published already quite widely on this topic and also worked with policy actors, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative, global policy, so very much also in line with what we try to do at the center, trying to relate research to policy options and politics on the ground. So I think, Amy, that you need this motivation going through your PhD and to relate your research to the politics as it unfolds in Canada, particularly here in BC, I think has been quite fascinating. And your presentation today very much can't be more timely considering what's happened at the moment, both in Canada and the US, and the contentious politics of how to move forward with big oil and mega projects like the oil sand industry. Maybe I should also mention that in January 21, Amy's beginning a SSHRC postdoctoral fellowship at the University of British Columbia. And so we will have her on the West Coast for a bit longer, which is great. So you just moved here, Amy, and so I hope you had a good first month of transition into living in Victoria. And again, welcome to the center, and hopefully we will meet you and your new puppy, France, soon as well, once, things open up a little bit. Amy, the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Oliver, for that very warm introduction. I'm new to the center, but I've really enjoyed my time here and the talk so far, and I'm really excited to be able to do my own talk today. I'll just share my slides with you, and I think you should be able to see me and the slides. So as Oliver mentioned, today I'll be speaking about my dissertation research. My dissertation is titled The Contentious Politics of Mega Oil Sands Pipeline Projects. And this is my first time talking about my research since I've emerged from my writing hole that I've been deep in the last few months as I scrambled to finish the dissertation. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today about some of my research findings, but also the process through which I approached this research and tried to tackle a pretty complex phenomena of pipeline politics as it is today. So I thought I would start by showing you a picture of the back of my family's farm. This is actually a pipeline right-of-way. You can see this grassy patch here. This is a pretty common site in southwestern Ontario and throughout North America where pipelines are buried in the ground. They are pretty out of sight, out of mind until something happens. My dad and my grandfather have spent many years engaging with pipeline companies, sometimes fighting pipeline companies and their new proposals. But this actually isn't what interested me in the topic of pipelines, although it is definitely a part of our family history. And actually, it helped the right-of-way. Actually, in COVID, my parents turned it into a campsite at the back of their farm. So they were glamping all summer long to get some respite from lockdown. But what actually really got me interested in the topic of pipelines was when I was just starting my dissertation in 2015, there were communities seemingly mobilizing across North America against oil sands pipeline infrastructure. So proposals that were trying to move Alberta oil and heavy oil from the Alberta oil sands to various export markets. So this is a community in St. John, New Brunswick that was mobilized against the Energy East proposal. That was in the spring of 2015. Also in the spring of 2015, there were protests against the Trans Mountain project, which I'll be talking a lot more about today. This was in Fort Langley. And later in 2015, this was a victory celebration when President then Obama canceled the Keystone project. And this was a rally outside of Prime Minister Trudeau's residence. It seems like a lifetime ago. So this was all happening as I entered the PhD. I had entered the program wanting to study the intersection of trade and climate, and I was really interested in structural barriers to climate action. But all this was going on, and I just couldn't stop thinking about these protests and wondering whether or not these protests were having an impact. And I was a student in social justice and peace studies, so I attended a protest or two. And I had often thought about the question then at various demonstrations, what was the impact of this? And so as these pipeline projects were being proposed, I realized, and as many other people realized, this was becoming a hot spot for climate action, among other things. And so I redirected my research and I became very interested in the impact of protests on pipeline outcomes. To give a bit of political economy context for my research, this is a snapshot of the pipeline network in North America. So the red is oil pipelines and the green are natural gas pipelines. And so this is a quite well-developed network of infrastructure that really began in the 1950s, but took off in the 80s and 90s. And Alberta is a central hub in the oil supply chain, which is really an international supply chain. Although most of the oil from Alberta goes to the US, Alberta is heavily embedded in this pipeline network. And so you can see the oil moves from Alberta to various centers in the US for domestic consumption. And so it was in the 2000s that there was, again, a new wave of mega oil sands infrastructure. And so this map, I won't go into the details and the nitty-gritty of these projects, but just to give you a sense that these dotted lines were all proposals that began after 2004, when there was a major oil boom in the oil sands in Alberta, and also significant demand in the US for Alberta oil and heavy oil in particular. There was a wave of new projects, and incidentally, none of them have actually been successfully completed. And so that was what I was really interested in understanding with my dissertation. So the question that I was asking in my dissertation, which is the bread and butter of a lot of political science dissertations, is what explains variation in the outcomes of mega oil sands projects, both ones that go entirely through Canada, but also ones that pass through Canada to go to the US. And the second question, the one that was really most interesting to me, was why is it that there have been several major projects recently that have not been successfully built? They were either canceled or they've been significantly delayed. So to try to tackle this, I started with a comparative method called qualitative comparative analysis, or QCA. This is a method that's becoming increasingly common in social science to understand complex causation, so cases where it's not just A leads to B, but there's a more complex causal pathway or sets of different pathways to lead to the outcome. I won't talk too much about the QCA today. I'll save that for another talk, but I wanted to highlight that I used this method to understand the outcomes of 18 different pipeline projects that were federally regulated by the National Energy Board, or the NEB, what's formerly known as the NEB. It's now called the Canada Energy Regulator, between 2006 and 2014. And I won't talk about all of the nitty-gritty of the method and the findings. I wrote about it in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, but the basic finding that I came to with this QCA was that contestation matters. So legal challenges are correlated with pipelines not being built, and as is the number of protests and a few other things, but it wasn't clear why it is that these things are correlated with pipeline outcomes. So for that, I needed to get into some in-depth cases. So I picked Northern Gateway and the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, two pipelines that haven't been built. One, Northern Gateway, that was canceled, and one, Trans Mountain, where the company walked away from the project, but in a shock to many people, the government stepped in and bought the project. And it's currently underway, but the outcome is not yet clear. But for the purposes of my dissertation, I considered a case where the project hasn't been successfully built. So I went to Calgary and Vancouver and Ottawa, and I did a bunch of interviews, around 70, with pipeline executives, leaders of NGOs that were opposed to the project, government actors, regulators, politicians, and legal firms, a whole slew of actors. And I did a lot of process tracing to try to map out what was happening in both of these cases and why was it that they haven't been built successfully. So just to run through very quickly some of the key points in both these cases. So Enbridge's Northern Gateway project, the map is the top right there, and Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Expansion project, that's the second map. They were both proposed to move heavy oil from Alberta, a bit north of Edmonton, from the oil sands to coasts in BC. In the case of Northern Gateway, the northern coast, and in the case of Trans Mountain, in the lower mainland, ending in Burnaby. Both projects were seeking to develop over 1,100 kilometers of new pipeline, and both would cross many communities, Indigenous communities, cities, especially in the lower mainland, in the Trans Mountain case, heavily populated urban areas. A key difference was that Northern Gateway was what's called a greenfield project, so no pipeline was had been there before, but in Trans Mountain, the Kinder Morgan decided that it would be easier to try to twin an existing line, so to build a pipeline alongside the existing pipeline in order to make the project easier to complete. In both cases, they were approved by the federal regulator, the National Energy Board, and they were also approved by the federal government at different times, but neither project has been completed. And I'll talk about this more about why this is. Another key point for both of these projects is that they both involve coalitions of actors that were opposed to the project, or campaign coalitions. So what I mean by campaign coalitions, in both cases, there were sets of actors that were quite diverse. They decided to come and work together to oppose a pipeline. And so campaign coalitions is the term that I use to talk about basically that phenomena. So there was a few different features of campaign coalitions that I find quite interesting. One, they require high levels of involvement. They require a lot of coordination, a lot of communication, a lot of resources, and they're actors that are deciding to work together beyond just a single protest or a single event, but to stop a pipeline. They are broad-based and diverse organizations that are part of campaign coalitions. And this picture here is sort of the quintessential representation of this concept, which was the Cowboy Indian Alliance, which is what they call themselves. This is in the Keystone Project, so not related to Northern Gateway or Trans Mountain, but this became somewhat of a model for pipeline protests, where you had groups that had very different interests that were coming together and in a very visual way, in a very unified way, to show that they were in solidarity and opposed to a project. And this was a very concerted strategy to get the attention of politicians. In this case, it was President Obama. It was the Washington protest, the march in 2014, that for the first time really put Keystone on the Obama administration's agenda. Third, this is relevant for us today at the Center for Global Studies. Although these coalitions are tackling a domestic issue around pipelines, or what could be considered a domestic issue around pipelines, there are really important transnational dynamics and dimensions. So one is funding. Often a lot of groups in Canada that are NGOs are trying to fund their campaign using funds from different philanthropic organizations. A lot of them are based in the US. Another transnational dimension is the framing that these groups use, whether it's talking about Indigenous rights and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or climate action and drawing on various climate agreements, including the Paris Agreement. And lastly, in both of my cases, and in the Keystone Project and in other cases as well, these campaign coalitions turn into social movements. So they have a very sustained collective action that often requires some kind of public march or protests in the streets, as well as a range of other tactics, which I'll talk about in a second. So to give you just a snapshot of what the campaign coalition looked like for the Northern Gateway Project, this is just a very abstract visualization that shows the network of actors. And you can see it's quite dense. These were all groups that were quite involved in opposing the Northern Gateway Project. And so even though these groups had different interests, they came together and worked together to resist the project. And they were often involved in other campaigns and other social movements. And that was a very important characteristic of the Northern Gateway campaign, was that it really built on work done in previous social movements and previous coalitions against various resource projects and forestry campaigns and salmon farming campaigns, and came together to oppose Northern Gateway. So just to give you a snapshot of some of the actors that were involved, you had kind of your classic advocacy NGOs like Forest Ethics. You had research-based organizations like Raincoast. You had legal charities like West Coast Environmental Law. You had Indigenous organizations like Coastal First Nations, and you had alliances of Indigenous groups like the Carriers Kenny Tribal Council. This is not exhaustive by any means, but it's just a glimpse of some of the main groups that were involved in opposing the project. In the Trans Mountain case, the map looks a little bit different. There were actually some actors that were involved in both Northern Gateway and Trans Mountain, but you can see just from looking at this briefly, it's not quite as dense as the Northern Gateway map, but still you had a lot of different actors. And so, for example, you had cities, including the city of Burnaby, you had local grassroots organizations. This one here is called Broke, Burnaby Residents Opposing the Kinder Mountain Expansion. You had NGOs, local NGOs, provincial NGOs, regional NGOs. Dogwood is a provincial one, Georgia Straight Alliance is a more regional one. And you had Indigenous groups, including the Tsleil-Waututh, and you had other Indigenous organizations like the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And again, this was just a few of the actors that were involved. So the core question for me and the rest of the dissertation became, so what is it about these campaign coalitions that might lead to influence, or what is it about these campaign coalitions that might lead them to have success or not? And so I decided to approach this. I'll spare you the theoretical story and journey that I went on in the dissertation, but I decided to look at the 5 main strategies that these actors use to try to influence the pipeline. And so this includes regulatory engagement, so being a part of the regulatory process and having their issues on the public record and their concerns voiced on the public record, and trying to overwhelm the process with voices of opposition, or to use scientific or traditional evidence to convince the regulator that the risks outweigh the benefits. Another main strategy was political access, so trying to find political allies like members of parliament or mayors, councillors that would align with the movement or align with the cause and be able to take it forward. Third is protest, so this includes everything from marches and demonstrations to more disruptive protests and civil disobedience, including work stoppages, blockades at the sites of construction and that kind of thing. Legal challenges, most of these would be to try to overturn the decision to approve a project. And lastly is engaging with the company's shareholders. So Enbridge's or Kinder Morgan shareholders, trying to bring resolutions forward at the annual general meetings that would showcase that investors were concerned or had concerns about risks associated with various parts of these projects. So to understand how these strategies actually play out, I developed this causal diagram at the request of my committee, which is kind of complicated, but I'll just highlight a couple of things here. You can see these 5 strategies are in the center. And so these strategies rely on specific tactics and mechanisms to have an influence, either to influence a government or to influence the pipeline company itself, which then will ultimately shape the project's outcome. But it's not just the strategies that exist in a vacuum. There's a whole slew of contexts and various background conditions that shape whether or not these strategies will be successful. And there's a bunch of questions about how many strategies are necessary to influence an outcome, the sequence of these strategies. And so that's what I get into in the dissertation, which I will just stay at a higher level for this talk. And I just wanted to walk you through a couple of the findings from both cases. So in the Northern Gateway case, there was a bunch of strategies that were unsuccessful. So initially, you could see that, or you might think that the campaign coalition was unsuccessful because the National Energy Board ultimately approved the project, as did the federal government. And even though the campaign coalition had been quite successful early on in trying to develop legislation to stop the pipeline, which took the form of basically a tanker ban along the north coast of BC. Once the federal government changed in 2011 and became a majority conservative government, it was no longer a hospitable environment to pass legislation, and so that effort failed. And even though the campaign coalition was quite actively engaged with Enbridge's shareholders, none of the resolutions had been successful. And so the campaign coalition decided to shift strategies. And after that strategic shift, which took place after the project was approved by the federal conservative government in 2014, the campaign coalition took stock and took another kind of multi-pronged approach to try to get the pipeline killed, essentially. So this included things like promising civil disobedience, using public opinion, which in British Columbia was very much increasingly in favor of or alongside the members of the campaign coalition. So there's usually around 2/3, at least 50%, but usually 2/3 opposition in any one poll against Northern Gateway. There was a number of legal challenges, over a dozen, and also there was a new window for political access in the 2015 federal election. And so I argue in the dissertation that it was really these latter two. It was an alignment of a political and legal opportunity, which came together at the same time, which allowed the project to be canceled. So in 2016, Justin Trudeau canceled the project officially. And in his speech, he said the Great Bear Rainforest is no place for a pipeline, and the Douglas Channel is no place for oil tanker traffic. And so this was seen as a huge victory for the anti-pipeline coalition, not only because the project was canceled, but also because this was a rallying cry for the project. And so this was a very powerful case of where the campaign coalition, their framing was actually taken up by the federal government. And so this was evidence of the framing earlier on. This was the president of WWF Canada, World Wildlife Foundation, who said in 2013 that the Great Bear Rainforest is no place for a pipeline. And so this was evidence of the campaign coalition being quite successful discursively and having their framing being taken up by the federal government. But that's not enough to explain why Justin Trudeau canceled the project and decided not to go forward with it. And so in the dissertation, I spent quite a bit of time talking about the different context pieces that enabled this decision. The first was the successful legal challenge, Gahatla Nation versus Canada, that was based on the duty to consult. So the federal government, the previous federal government, fell vastly short of their duty to consult. And so the outcome of that legal challenge coincided with the new federal government. And so there are a few other pieces. One was public opinion, particularly in BC, was against the pipeline. The project had few vocal supporters, including the Premier BC then, Christy Clark, who ultimately came out to oppose the project. The campaign coalition had been very successful in mobilizing support for a tanker ban. So even though the conservative federal government in 2014 made it impossible to pass that kind of legislation, once the new federal government was in place, they had already committed to a tanker ban. And so that was a legacy of that campaign that was quite successful. And the final piece was that Justin Trudeau had two other major mega pipelines that were also needed to be approved. And so that allowed that gave some political cover, essentially, to cancel Northern Gateway. So one of those other projects was Trans Mountain, in which Justin Trudeau approved the same day. And explaining the Trans Mountain case is a little bit more complicated because it went further in the construction process. The pipeline company, Kinder Morgan, had decided to go ahead officially with construction and had already started construction when opposition really ramped up. So like Northern Gateway, initially it appeared that the campaign coalition was unsuccessful. The National Energy Board approved the project, as did the federal government. Again, the members of the campaign coalition filed a number of legal challenges, around 19. And again, there was a very important important political opportunity. And so this was provincial this time in the 2017 BC election, which was a surprise outcome. The NDP Green Coalition government, which was very aligned with the anti-pipeline campaign. And so the timing of that election coincided with a very important point in the project's development, which had just received approval and was just going forward to try to get the funding for construction. And so this combination of things, this disruptive election, and alongside a number of other things, project delays, project increased costs, and sustained movement on the ground with blockades and protests, it eventually became too much for Kinder Morgan. And so here are a few pictures. This is from March 2018. This is when you see the civil disobedience and massive protests begin, rallying behind Indigenous leaders, including Tsleil-Waututh leader and the BC Union of Indian Chiefs, and 5,000 strong march, up to 5,000 strong in this march here. You see flotillas in both Canada and the US at Kinder Morgan's infrastructure. And you see Burnaby become a site of disruptive protests with regular work disruptions. And there were over 200 arrests in March of 2018, or up to 200 arrests in March of 2018, including former Green Party leader Elizabeth May. So essentially you had a confluence of factors for Kinder Morgan, and ultimately Kinder Morgan walked away from the project. And to get a sense of the logic around a project of this scope and scale and this kind of complexity, I have this quote from a pipeline executive that I interviewed in 2019, who said, "You have to have a belief that you'll ultimately be successful and can construct the project. And if you get to the point where, for whatever reason, commercial, legal, political, regulatory, at some point you don't spend good money after bad." And that's the reality. When the straw breaks the camel's back, there's more than that final straw. There's a lot of straw on the camel, and the camel breaks. It's not the single straw, it's the entire load. And so there were a lot of straws in the Kinder Morgan case. There was increasing reputational risk. There was regulatory risk with the new BC government that was threatening bitumen regulations. There was legal risk with a number of legal challenges that were pending. The costs of the project were increasing, and the project was delayed. And so this essentially led Kinder Morgan to the decision point where it wasn't worth proceeding with the project anymore. And so that's only one part of the story. The other part of the story is that both the federal and the Alberta provincial governments were willing to take on the project, or were willing to support the project. And after a brief negotiation period, the federal government ended up buying the project outright. And so to conclude, I just have a couple more minutes here. So I'll just wrap up with some conditions that I developed in the dissertation to understand when pipeline coalitions are likely to be successful. And I think this applies to both oil pipelines, the ones that I talked about, the ones that I mentioned in my QCA, but also natural gas pipelines as well, even though that's not what I look at in my dissertation. And so it's really about the mobilization potential associated with new types of linear infrastructure. So new mega oil sands projects, they have a high potential for mobilization. But in both cases, Northern Gateway and Trans Mountain, it was having very coordinated early opposition that really allowed the campaign coalition to pick up momentum early on, and to be able to sustain the momentum and sustain through resources years-long campaigns, which were very intensive in terms of leadership, resources, moral support, and that kind of thing. The second condition is around weathering political adversaries. I don't get into it so much in this talk, but particularly around Northern Gateway, there was a very hostile federal political environment. And so the campaign coalition was able to withstand that multi-pronged, essentially, attack on the campaign coalition, and was able to withstand that and became ultimately successful once the federal political opportunity changed with the 2015 election. And so having political allies is a key source of influence for these campaign coalitions. And finally, the last condition involves being involved in the regulatory process, usually using that regulatory engagement and also delays within that process, leveraging those things to have influence on the project outcome. In both cases, many actors were involved in the regulatory process, and it's quite a lengthy undertaking, and it's quite resource intensive and quite time consuming, and often is quite narrowly constructed to look at very specific potential consequences of a pipeline. So there is a lot of reasons why groups that were participating in these engagement processes became quite frustrated, and it's quite draining on them. But ultimately, these processes are quite lengthy, and there's a lot of opportunities when there's regulatory blunders or certain decisions that really can allow a campaign coalition to reach out for new allies, public support and attention. And ultimately, as political scientist Kathy Harrison says, delay can become a critical political resource, particularly in infrastructure projects. And so we saw that particularly in Northern Gateway, where the regulatory process spanned a number of years. And ultimately, the campaign coalition was successful. And I'll just conclude by talking a bit about the research that I plan to do once I defend my dissertation and start my postdoc in January. I'm interested in two pieces that kind of flowed from my dissertation. One is the relationship between finance and contestation and infrastructure. So increasingly, we see a lot of the contestation happening where pipeline companies are looking for funds for their project or reaching out to various investors and banks. And so social movement actors are increasingly becoming savvy at trying to disrupt or create a lot of risk for banks and institutional investors. And so this is a space where there's a lot of change happening right now. And then the second piece that I'm really interested in is to look comparatively at other cases in other countries where there's significant protests against fossil fuel infrastructure. And oftentimes there are global and transnational networks of activists that are involved in opposing different kinds of fossil fuel infrastructure, be it coal port terminals in Australia, liquefied natural gas pipelines. And so there's, I think, a lot to be understood and learned about how different campaign coalitions in different countries are more or less successful in creating policy change. And so I'll leave it there for now, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy. Let me go back here. Yeah. You can see the virtual clapping here. Yeah, let me also add to the sentiment. Yeah, you could really feel, how rich your thesis is and how, in a way, appealing must have been also to follow something that was evolving as you wrote your PhD, right? So you could probably open the newspapers and then learn something new about how the campaigns would evolve, and also looking into the future. I think you must have learned quite a bit following these particular case studies quite closely. So who would like to start us off? Let me just check the chat box. Please don't feel whoever wants to join us, let me just know, either raising your hand or leaving something in the chat box. Rod, okay, that's also, if you turn on your camera, I can see, you would like to come in. Rod, please.
Well, thank you very much. A very, very interesting discussion. As Oliver says, very challenging to be doing it all in real time. I wonder, picking up on your last point, the success comes with leveraging delays. And I wonder, we can be sympathetic to the environmental cause, but I wonder how you feel about this as, in some sense, a risk of real tyranny of minorities, that it is very easy to bring regulatory processes and political processes to a standstill, even though you're representing only a very small part of a democratic community. You have any worries on that count?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that came up a lot in different in some of my different interviews is, how do you design a regulatory process that is inclusive and also efficient? And so this is something that the National Energy Board has struggled quite a lot with. And when a process doesn't include the actors that are directly involved and the issues that are directly relevant to them, it creates a lot of distrust in the regulatory process. And so we saw that particularly in the Trans Mountain case. I didn't talk about it in the presentation, but the National Energy Board process was designed really in response to fear that the process was going to take a really long time, because there was a lot of people that were concerned about this project. And so the NEB decided to basically err on the side of efficiency and had a very limited regulatory process. And so that created a huge headache for the NEB. It created a lot of procedural conflict and a lot of conflict that took place outside of the NEB when people took to the streets because they basically had lost faith in the regulator. So that's a kind of a cautionary tale of what happens when you have a process that people don't perceive as legitimate. In terms of the minority versus majority, this is something that's very interesting. You see various groups try to leverage opinion polling, and depends who are your constituents and who counts as the majority and the minority. And so this is something that you see a lot in linear infrastructure. You have benefits that are broadly defined by the proponent as helping the national economy or helping the provincial economy, or helping a specific region with jobs. And then you have usually the opponents who emphasize risks to, again, particular communities, or that are often more regional in nature. And so
Amy, you're muted. Yeah, here we go.
There we go. So essentially, these are huge questions that thankfully I don't have to answer, as I'm not making these decisions. But basically, to try to answer your question, you have competing sets of rights and competing constructions of risk and competing constructions of benefits. And so none of these things are automatic, I would say, and it's very much a process of groups trying to construct their rights or their interests in a way that captures a broader public, whether that's economic benefits or whether that's environmental risks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. Vic, could you hold up? Yeah, I think Sheffa's next, and then we have you. Would this be okay, Vic? Great. So Sheffa, you're next.
Okay, great. Thanks. Amy, do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a wonderful talk. I appreciate your being here. And of course, I know Scott, because Scott and I work together at the Cascade Institute. So I'm happy to meet you for the first time. I just had a simple question. I don't know if it's simple to ask. I don't know if it's simple to answer. But I remember I participated in the Keystone Pipeline protests in DC when 350.org started that. I think it was 2011. And I just recall from that experience how big a gap there often is in people's understanding about the relationship between a proposed project and a completed project, and how long that takes and how many factors there are involved. And it just simply hasn't been clear to me since that time when these pipeline projects do not go ahead, how much of that can be attributed to protests and how much of that is the result of the constellation of all the market factors that have to come together to make one of these, and political factors, of course, right? The whole political economy of it, all those things, all the variables that have to come together to make a project work. And I'm just wondering if you've got some insight into that based on what you've been looking at.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question. That's really what interested me at the very beginning was, you hear a lot of economists say, well, the oil sands, really the future of the oil sands and any future projects really depends on oil prices. And so if oil prices are good, you have these proposals, they're commercially viable just by virtue of the fact that they're existing, because they must have commercial interests in order to even get to the proposal phase or to even get to the fairly early regulatory stage. So you hear oftentimes that all these projects are very commercially viable and commercially sound, and it's just there's delays, there's death by 1,000 cuts, there's a lot of protests, there's a lot of political ill will on the part of certain party leaders who are in power, and these are the reasons why pipelines don't get built, oil pipelines in particular. And so I was initially quite skeptical of that narrative, but after doing all this research, I actually there's a lot of caveats, but there actually is quite a bit of truth to that. And so the cases that I looked at in the QCA, I was really interested in looking at kind of the business as usual cases of projects that were successful. And there were quite a few up until 2009 when things really started to grind to a halt. And basically in the cases, and talking only about oil pipelines, gas, it's definitely different, and the economics are more volatile and they're more vulnerable commercially than the oil sands pipelines. But speaking just about oil sands pipelines, and the ones that I looked at, so the major ones like Keystone, Northern Gateway, Trans Mountain, Energy East, all of them basically were stopped for reasons that were not related to their commercial viability. One caveat is Energy East, and that's a really interesting case. That was a case where the project was actually withdrawn before the NEB actually made the determination. And it's a case where there's endless debate where some economists will say it's the same company with Keystone and Energy East. So some economists will say, the oil prices were changing. Keystone was back on when it had been off, and that was why Energy East was proposed, was kind of a backup as an alternative to Keystone. And so that's an interesting case where commercial context does play a bigger role, certainly, but there was a lot of factors related to opposition and greenhouse gas regulations, emissions, that made that project less viable, in addition to the changing commercial constraints. So in a lot of the cases, I actually find that there is quite a bit of commercial support, and it really has come down to regulatory processes that become quite long, and there's a lot of contestation, and there's a lot of legal risk, and there's a lot of reputational risk, and things just accumulate for the pipeline company that initially when they proposed the project, it looked very relatively straightforward, and then they realized after many years that it was eventually the project becomes less viable once there's delays and increased costs and these kind of things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, the way part of what you're saying is that it's a protest against a pipeline adds additional variables and risks that become part of the decision matrix and can overwhelm the regulatory process, right? They can kind of tip it over into this point where it's no longer viable. Is that my understanding you right?
Yeah, exactly. And then specifically on the point of protest, I'm glad that you mentioned that or asked me to clarify. It depends on the case, and it depends when the protest is taking place. But in the case of Northern Gateway, protests really function as a way to raise the political salience of the issue. And so then when the 2015, the Liberal Party came in, there was all this backlog of a lot of opposition, along with, public opinion that was turning against the project, and these very visual, high profile cases of resistance all along, that was just part of the narrative about why there's just basically this project shouldn't go forward, that the government saw as less politically viable. In the Trans Mountain case, protests functioned a little bit differently. It was more in the later stages of the project where it was getting boots to the ground, and then you have all this disruptive protest that was threatening the project's timeline. And the company was facing, specific construction windows, and there were, protesters tying themselves to the gates of, the Burnaby tank farm. And so that protest functioned less, sort of more in a more disruptive function. And so in total, when I look at the role of protests, it either functions as a sort of signal to policymakers, and particularly with Keystone XL is very effective with Obama when protesters circled the White House and you had these very visual protests. Whereas in some of the other cases, it's less direct and it becomes part of, like you say, one piece of this sort of moving decision-making matrix, where it's really the legal risk, that is what investors are really concerned about. But that's also tied to protests as well. There's a lot of, mutual, the same groups that are filing legal challenges are organizing the protests. So, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? The protests that you see are basically one of many strategies.
Yeah, thank you. It's very thorough. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Shefa. Vic.
Thank you. Let me add my thanks to the presentation, Amy. I guess a question we all have is, what do you think is going to happen to TMX? But you can comment on that if you so wish. I was particularly interested that in your future research, you're going to look at the issue of finance and financial pressure on the investors. And I wondered in particular about the relative influence that's happening at universities across the country, pressure on rearranging their financial investments in fossil fuel industries. A good example is UBC. Welcome your comments on that. Thanks.
Thanks so much for the comments. Yeah, on TMX, you'd think I would have a really strong projection about whether or not it's going to get built. As political scientists, we're notoriously bad at projecting things, but I think at this point, I think it might actually get built for a few reasons. One, the government is a very different, has a different risk profile than a private company. And so this project, the government knew was way over budget to begin with and has been very closed about, the books. So the government knew that they were walking into a bit of an economic disaster with it, but still chose to go ahead, which is pretty incredible. But it seems like with the government sort of steering the ship, there was a lot more capacity to negotiate with particular Indigenous communities and to deliver on certain things that were needed to address their risks, their concerns and risks with the project. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do see the project continue, although in this current context, I'm not sure how bets are off with COVID now, but it seems like if it is built, this will be the last new piece of mega oil sands infrastructure. So this could be constructed, but it might be the last major pipeline in the oil, like it related to oil sands infrastructure. In terms of your other question on divestment and infrastructure, this is something that has been really interesting to watch over the last couple of years as investors have become much more open to ideas of material risk related to climate change. This is something that for many years has been kind of in the works. There's been a slow building cascade of norms around carbon risk and climate risk disclosure, but it's really reached a tipping point in the last 2-3 years. And so in the Trans Mountain case, as soon as Kinder Morgan, as they were just making the decision to basically get out of the project, at the same time as they were doing that, there were 2 successful shareholder resolutions at their annual general meeting, which was quite shocking, and they're pretty rare to have a successful resolution. And one of them was around climate disclosure. And so that in itself can be seen as a triumph for a lot of these more activist institutional investors that have been working for many years to try to bring climate disclosure into the boardrooms of major companies. And in terms of the university movement, I think the value of it is really normative. It's this norm shift where companies are now having to reconcile whether or not their long-term investments are compatible with a 2-degree or 1.5-degree world. And so even though, you know, the argument is that it would take every institution to divest in order for it to actually move the needle, right? These cash flows are very much in flux. You know, investors are you know, fossil fuel companies are constantly searching for new investors, and Canada, our big 5 banks are very much more than happy to provide those loans. So in terms of the material impact, it's less clear, but in terms of the normative impact, I think that's where you see this norm around climate change disclosure move from, you know, pension funds to universities to big banks, international big banks, Canadian banks less so, but I think you're definitely seeing a normative shift there, and the university movement is part of that for sure.
Great, thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. There's actually quite a bit of movement at UVic on this front as well, so we might hear something going forward, but at least, you know, UVic is very much part of this discussion and considering how to re-emphasize its investments through the pension fund, but also more broadly. Anyone else? If not, I have whatever question for Amy. Amy, you spoke very vividly about how social movements address the oil sands, pipelines, and so forth. And if you look back at your years of research, you know, what are critical elements to make a social movement, a campaign, protest successful? You described in, I think one of your first slides was you're building a broad coalition, seems to be your point. You know, if you build these broad coalitions, you know, that seems to be a recipe for success, right? You know, bring lots of groups into the mold and bring them together. My question is in a way, is it really, you know, how they organize, who they bring in, or is it more timing? Is it the political opportunity structure? You can do whatever you want. You can bring all these people in, unless you have an audience that listens to you and that is somewhat responsive to the claims. That might be, you know, different issues. So I'm just wondering, if you were to advise social movements, yeah, what are the key elements of success in this respect? And in this context, could you also briefly talk about the relationship between indigenous communities in this fight against pipelines and broader coalitions or society coalitions? To what degree was it a relatively successful way of building these coalitions? Were there tensions between indigenous communities and let's say environmentalists more broadly? You know, I'm just wondering whether you could tell us a little bit from your field research what you found there.
Yeah, those are great questions and loaded questions. And I'll, what makes a successful campaign coalition? That it really depends, I think, on the issue area. So I don't want to be too much in the weeds around pipelines, because part of it is about the timing of the pipeline, you know, how they're able to negotiate, and, you know, how they're able to engage with the regulatory process, how they're able to engage with governments that approve projects and that kind of thing. So certainly it takes, you know, political allies, and you see these campaign coalitions align themselves with particular parties, you know, the NDP or the Greens or the Liberal Party at certain points, and that's been more or less successful, and not always successful. At one point in Trans Mountain, and I'm sure people will remember the previous BC election, when the NDP came out opposed to Trans Mountain, it actually ended up contributing to their loss to Christy Clark. And so that was an interesting case to show that it's not always just you get a political ally and then, you know, you're off to the races. There's a lot of contingency involved. But in terms of some of the broader sort of structural features of successful campaign coalitions, I think certainly there's an appeal to having a broad-based campaign coalition to show that you have farmers and indigenous groups and municipalities, and it's not just from one sector or one level of authority. You have pressure from different levels of authority and from different places. And so coordinating those claims becomes really important. I think pipeline campaigns are very interesting because there is a very specific target. And so campaigns are, geared to trying to take, to oppose a particular project, but they use different discourses or different frames. And so that's something that worked out really well in both cases, but it might not have. You had groups, Indigenous groups often have very different interests than environmental organizations. And so they were able to develop common frames, even though they had different interests. And so it was often around spill protection or salmon or, the actual regulatory process itself in the Trans Mountain case. Because so many groups were very frustrated with that process, that became a point of commonality between these different groups. So that's another thing I would say. And then resources really matter. These are extremely resource intensive campaigns. It takes a lot of funding to engage in a regulatory process, to bring legal challenges. It takes a lot of leadership and staff to be participating in these processes, to be coordinating between different groups. And so that's definitely an enabling condition. And then to your second question about the relationship between environmental groups and Indigenous organizations, that's a really fascinating question, and one that I can really only partially answer because most of my interviews tended to be with either environmental organizations or legal firms that were representing First Nations, but not so much with Indigenous leaders themselves. And there's a few reasons for that. But essentially in the Northern Gateway case, groups, Indigenous groups and NGOs tended to have a history of working together. And so that was often through forestry campaigns, Clayoquot Sound and the Great Bear Rainforest campaign and various other campaigns. They tended to work out a lot of differences, and there was very different ways of approaching the campaign and approaching what they wanted to get out of it. And so NGOs and Indigenous leaders learned a lot of valuable lessons about how to work together. And those really came in handy with the Northern Gateway case. And so for the most part, there was often quite a lot of respect between the different actors in the coalition, and there was often not a lot of tension. And so that really contributed to a successful public front for the Northern Gateway campaign. And in Trans Mountain, there were fewer Indigenous participants in the campaign coalition. And so there was a few different reasons for that. But again, they took lessons from what happened in the Northern Gateway case. And so there was specific organizations that were working in key places on the Trans Mountain case. And so groups would choose to work together on some things, so filing legal cases, but would also choose to retain their political autonomy and to be able to go at it alone in other cases. And so that was a key reason, I think, that different sets of actors were able to overcome their differences and work together.
Thanks, Amy. Anyone else? While you might be thinking about another question, in the end, you spoke about your abilities to engage in comparative work. The one fascinating case study, sorry, my own bias here, was how Germany had seen an environmental anti-nuclear movement for 30, 40 years, right? And then it took one critical event, the Fukushima disaster, as an enabling context. A million people out in the street, and from one day to the other, Germany abandoned nuclear energy, basically, right? Yeah, so that was when all these factors came together, probably a context, the availability of other energy sources, but then also the dramatic event that turned public opinion and in a way changed an environment which was very stable for decades, right? And so it's fascinating to see under what circumstances do these campaigns then bear fruit, right, and become successful in the end.
Yeah, the role of disaster, and especially and I didn't talk about it in the talk, but oil spills played a huge role. Spills that were both historic spills that were quite far away, the Exxon Valdez disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. Campaign coalitions were able to successfully use spills from oil pipelines or from oil infrastructure to make the case that pipelines aren't safe. And so anytime there was a spill, big or small, the campaign coalition seized on that opportunity. And it was the Kalamazoo spill in Michigan that was happening around the time that Northern Gateway was going through the regulatory process. And it was Enbridge who was responsible. And so that was a turning point for the BC government and seeing Enbridge's response and lack of response. That was one of the contributing factors to why the Clark government ended up not supporting Northern Gateway. So these things intersect in very interesting ways, certainly.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Ted? Ted and then Rod? I think Ted was about 1 second earlier.
Oh, you're on.
Ted, you need to unmute yourself.
Usually my wife tells me just the opposite. Amy, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Maybe to play to build off of Oliver and Vic, the wonderful discussion in and around the diversity of the coalitions. And maybe to add to that, and maybe the question would come from a multinational lens, and it's maybe speaks to some of the research you're going to be getting into. But when you look at the Paris Agreement and international agreement around UNDRIP and BC's support of that, or the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that certainly are compromised, that international agreement, but the ecosystems are compromised via the pipelines going through all the different territories. And maybe to add to that, there's this trend in Europe, as Oliver may make a couple of related references, but the Green Deal in Europe and South Korea signed on, is developing its own, and to some extent, I understand China. And of course, Canada has entertained the Green New Deal for a little while. We'll see where that goes. But now that we have the Biden administration coming into power in the States and doing possibly some version or supporting some version of that, then maybe all of that will translate into some kind of international Green New Deal. But the question is in and around this multinational aspect, as maybe there's a bit of a trend to these international agreements that could counter the propensity for pipelines going forward. Yet one more significant influence. Just wondering if you had any commentary on that at this point, or certainly look forward to following your research and see what you uncover there.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And that's a really fascinating conversation that's happening right now, and that I'm not completely tapped into, but something that's going to be very interesting to watch is that in the international arena, there is talk of a proliferation, kind of like a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but for fossil fuels, that some of the key architects of these campaigns that I've been talking about are working together on. And so, there's been various attempts like this in the past, the Powering Past Coal Alliance with several countries that have agreed to phase out coal. And so the idea is to take it one step further and to extend it to all fossil fuels. And this is very much in the nascent early stages, but it's an interesting phenomena to see that a lot of these things took place domestically. There's certainly transnational activist networks that are connecting these different sites and different struggles, but now they're moving one step further to more coordinated international action around it, potentially around a treaty. And so I think the idea with it is to build, again, more of a normative appeal for phasing out fossil fuels. And so that's something that I think will be very interesting to see going forward, how that will provide more support for different groups that are struggling, because as often people say in pipeline campaigns, it's sort of a whack-a-mole approach where, there's one pipeline struggle and then another proposal becomes online, and then the contestation moves to that one. And so a lot of the activists have been trying to scale up and think, well, let's take a more what's a more permanent solution? And so one of the answers is this treaty against fossil fuels. So we'll see if that gets any legs and where that might go. But certainly there's a lot happening in the international sphere, or a lot of potential to connect these different struggles in various countries.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Rod, do you still want to come in?
Sorry, if there are no other questions pending, I'd come back to a different take on the question I raised earlier around the asymmetry in all of this. It is easier to mount a campaign to block something than it is to mount a campaign to promote. You know, Extinction Rebellion is working hard to promote things, but getting less traction than the coalition campaigns that you're talking about, Amy. And I'm wondering, we saw much less Indigenous involvement in the coalition campaign on TMX because there was so much more positive Indigenous interest in seeing the pipeline go forward. And so we have this question whether whether the asymmetry is a real structural problem in democratic process. If we thought of the cabinet, federal cabinet, making a decision, as you say, it's still possible that they may well make a decision to go forward with TMX. You could imagine around the cabinet table, there would be a lot of people representing constituents who would be positively in favor of seeing the pipeline go forward. And so the mechanisms for determining whether it's a good thing work rather differently in the sort of a cabinet deliberation context as opposed to the question, how many people can you get on the street? I don't know how you solve that problem, but I'll put it to you.
Yeah, that's something that I've thought a lot about, that social movements are generally geared towards trying to create some kind of democratic intervention, either in the regulatory process. You saw this with Northern Gateway, where the members of the campaign coalition tried to essentially swamp the process with as many people who were opposed to the project as possible, with the sort of theory of change that if there was 99% of interveners against the project and 1% that were, then the NEB would decide that it was not in the public interest, and so that didn't work. And so you see time and again these campaign coalitions coming up against these regulatory processes and trying to figure out how to navigate them or leverage them. And mobilizing public opinion is certainly something that they do if public opinion is in their favor. And in the Trans Mountain case, as you allude, public opinion was quite divided, and so it was not effective for the campaign coalition to leverage public opinion. So instead, they leveraged how many people would be willing to participate in more disruptive protests. And so, so it is quite a complex kind of set of dynamics about who's talking the loudest and whose rights are at stake, and how do you decide, right? And in terms of the Indigenous participation in the coalition, there's quite a few interesting differences between Northern Gateway and Trans Mountain in terms of why there was specific, why in Northern Gateway there was quite a bit of solidarity among different Indigenous groups along the whole pipeline that were very opposed to the project, and you didn't have that same solidarity in Trans Mountain. And part of that is because Kinder Morgan learned from Enbridge in negotiating and working with Indigenous communities along the pipeline. Part of it was the benefits packages that were introduced earlier on in the negotiation process. There was a whole bunch of factors. And often, though, in Trans Mountain, there were a lot of groups that were not willing to publicly take a position on either side, because to do so would either close negotiation with Kinder Morgan and foreclose that possibility. Whereas you had that in Enbridge, because Enbridge quite early on took made some mistakes in their engagement, and Indigenous groups were just outright opposed. And so it was a bit more complicated in Trans Mountain. And so then as the federal government, they have to decide how to go forward with those relationships and how to make a decision, which, as you allude, it's quite difficult to try to make a single decision with a pipeline where it's very binary. You either build it or you don't. And so that's what makes for a great social movement, but it makes it very complicated and much of a headache as a policy issue.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
But let me also thank Amy very much for the wonderful presentation and sharing with us her research, her PhD research, and which should come to completion very soon. And well, best of luck, for your next endeavors. I think you have a very rich research agenda here, and I think it's most promising and very timely what you do.